Hello and welcome to this little video discussing pollinators and permaculture with Poppy. And I thought where better to film a video about pollinators than in a pollinator heaven, which is a wildflower meadow. So I thought I'd begin by just introducing what is permaculture. So permaculture is basically the idea that we should be creating or designing and creating resilient, sustainable systems which can last into the future. And so to do that, we need to observe nature, because in nature we observe many systems such as forests or meadows or hedgerows which self-sustain. So nobody really has to go and do anything. All the features within the system just sort of feed into each other. It keeps the system balanced, and it means that the system can last without need of input. When we come to talk about permaculture in regards to gardening, we want to be observing nature and trying to mimic that in our gardens. And one of the key things is to bring in diversity and try and move away from the idea of monocropping. More different plants, more different creatures that can live within and among those plants, because that diversity is going to support you as a gardener. The plants and the creatures are going to support each other, and so your garden will be abundant and thriving as well as full of life. And we all want to be creating habitat and helping conserve the wildlife that exists on our earth. So throughout the talk I'm going to be explaining how, as a permaculturalist, I see pollinators play into the garden space. I'm going to be using as the idea of function stacking, and that is the idea that any element within a system will have more than one function. For example, a nasturtium plant might be offering forage for pollinators. It has beautiful leaves which spread out, so they offer a living mulch. So they cover the soil and protect it, keep it nice and cool so the water doesn't evaporate as easily, and when it does rain, the rain doesn't pummel down onto the soil surface. It also offers an edible yield, so the leaves and also the flowers are edible and actually really delicious, as well as being beautiful, so it's an aesthetic yield. So the function of the nasturtium plant is so much more than just edible or just a pollinator-friendly plant. It's got all these different functions. So what is pollination and what are pollinators? So pollination is when the pollen grain, which is the male sperm, I suppose, of a plant, is moved from the male part of a flower to the female part of the flower, which leads to fertilization, and that leads to fertilized seed, and it also often means that there is a fruit that forms. So for example, an apple, for pollination to occur, we need pollinators. Now pollinators are not just honeybees. There's so many kinds of pollinators. We've got birds, bats, moths, flies, beetles. All sorts of creatures act as pollinators, and some plants even rely on wind or water for pollination. And actually I read a really interesting fact a while ago that 1 in every 2 mouthfuls of food we eat is food that came because of pollinators. So plants rely heavily on pollinators for their reproduction. And even if you're not eating an apple, which is the direct result of pollination, even if you're eating a lettuce salad, for example, to grow more lettuce you need pollination, because the flowers need to be pollinated to give you more seeds, so you can sow more seeds, so you can eat the leaves. So even though you're eating a leaf crop, you still require the pollination process to happen to give you more lettuce. And from a permaculture perspective, we want to be looking at saving our own seed so that we can sow that the next year. And so allowing plants to go to flower in order to allow for forage for pollinators, it also means that we can gather the seed afterwards and have that for our own personal seed sovereignty. And it means that we can protect and develop species of plants that are perfectly adapted to our site. So if my garden's particularly dry, it might slowly get better at living in a dry landscape. If it's particularly dark, it might develop very large leaves so that it can capture more sunlight. So over time, if we save our own seed, we start to produce varieties of plants that are perfectly suited to our growing environment. Pollinators are really the sexual go-betweens of plants. They are what is required for plants to reproduce, and so providing habitat and forage for pollinators is important even if you're not growing your own food, even if you aren't necessarily even growing your own garden, even if you're just growing in a container on your doorstep or a window box, whatever it is. By creating habitat and food for pollinators, you're basically contributing to the conservation of our natural world, because they're so important within ecosystems, as well as contributing to our ability to grow our own food and for your neighbour to grow their own food. The kind of air of diversity here because of permaculture, I thought I would talk a little bit about different kinds of pollinators, kind that might not only pollinate but might also contribute not only to a healthy ecosystem but actually actively in the garden as maybe pest control. First up, we have hoverflies, and actually hoverflies refer to a huge portion of flies, not just the typical ones you might think of, which are the ones that look like wasps. They don't sting and they just hover around. That's how you know they're hoverflies, they're hovering. But there are actually many kinds of them, ranging in size and colour and even what they eat. But the vast majority of them will eat nectar, and so they will pollinate your flowers. Any of their young, their larvae, eat aphids. And now aphids are little creatures that hang around on the stems or leaves of plants, and they suck the sap out of the plants, and so they're kind of like vampires. One or two of them is okay, but when you're inundated they can really cripple the plant's growth. Having insects like hoverflies around a really important, healthy part of an ecosystem where things keep each other in balance, rather than a boom of one kind of creature with no predator to keep it in its place. So as well as eating aphids, the larvae of many hoverflies also eat decaying organic matter, so stuff like dead leaf litter, maybe dying roots, maybe tree bark, all these different things in the soil the larvae will eat, and so they contribute to building healthy, carbon-rich soils which are diverse, full of life. Hoverflies have all these functions. They're not just pollinators, they're also pest control, they're also helping to build healthy soils. Now, hoverflies really enjoy easily accessible nectar. So they like calendula, they like nasturtiums, they like sunflowers, and again, all of those three plants have more than the function of just pollination. So they're going to be enticing the hoverflies in, but sunflowers, you can eat the seeds. They can provide really great structure and support for other plants. They also act as an aphid trap, so they'll lure the aphids away from other plants, and because they're so vigorous with their growth, it doesn't really matter if they're covered in aphids. They're also beautiful, which counts as a function. Nasturtiums, like I said, they're edible, delicious, wonderful flowers, great mulch. And then the calendula is often used, the flowers, to make beautiful, really soothing balms, healing balms for the skin, so it's medicinal, as well as the leaves being edible. The flowers are also edible, but they don't taste necessarily fantastic. And again, they're beautiful. Now, as we can see, not only does the pollinator, but the plants that encourage the pollinator have so many functions within a garden or a healthy ecosystem. Next up, we have moths, which are potentially quite unsuspecting pollinators, and it actually wasn't until recently that scientists realised that moths play such a key role in pollination. Now, lots of pollinators like bees will stay predominantly in one area surrounding their hives, so they're not going to be travelling for absolutely miles and miles. Moths, on the other hand, under the cover of darkness, are going to travel miles, and that basically improves the genetic diversity of the plant. So it means that the genetics from a plant miles and miles away from another plant have the potential of mingling and creating progeny. As well as being fantastic pollinators, moths also are a very key role in the food chain. Their larvae is eaten by shrews and hedgehogs, which also are going to be eating your slugs and snails. So again, it's the presence of a healthy ecosystem where you have all the correct predators in place that means that you have a balance in your space, in your garden, your habitat, and so you're not having as many pest and disease issues. It's all just sort of looking after itself. And actually Bill Mollison talked about something called hammock time, which is the idea that in any system it should be designed so that we have plenty of time to sit in our hammocks and relax, and he thought that was a really important part of human life. And so by creating these resilient, diverse systems, it means that so many of the jobs that gardeners do are filled by the creatures, because if the hoverflies larvae are eating the aphids, then I don't need to go around picking the aphids off my tomato plants. And if there's going to be shrews in my garden eating the slugs, I don't need to go out at night with my torch picking slugs off my lettuce. Next up we have lacewings, and lacewings are fantastic pollinators, and their larvae also eat aphids. They again love calendula and sunflowers. They also love dill, and dill again is a medicinal herb as well as being a delicious culinary herb in the kitchen. I love dill and beetroot soup. So again, this is a plant that's not only encouraging pollinators into our space, but again has so many functions. Lacewings also love flowers like cosmos, which have edible flowers and are really fantastic for cut bouquets. So lacewings require habitat for them to hibernate in, somewhere where they can be safe and warm and cozy through our long British winters. And the kind of habitat they enjoy is stuff like piles of leaves, log piles, brick piles, even just tiles or slates leaning against a wall, anywhere dry and warm. And so a great way to entice lacewings into our garden is by just being a little bit less tidy, maybe leaving the leaves out or raking them into a pile rather than burning them all. It doesn't have to be anything as dramatic as creating a massive insect hotel. Just by being a little bit less tidy in your garden creates so many habitat options for so many different creatures. See what happens in the natural world. Leaves are left in piles, logs are left decaying on the ground, and if we mimic these natural scenarios, we're bound to be encouraging more diversity and more creatures into our growing space, and that is what gives our systems resilience. We want to do slow and simple solutions. So if you do assess your growing space and decide that you want to do something different, just stop for a second, observe the space and try to implement slow and simple solutions and build up from there. So, again, just as simple as not raking the leaves one year. Just as simple as leave your wildflowers standing and just take it from there and build up and up. For example, my garden is very shady, and to entice pollinators into my garden, I could just buy a wildflower seed mix and sow under my trees, but I'd very quickly find that actually wildflowers don't grow well in shade, and so I would have wasted my time and my money sowing those seeds, cleared all the space under the trees, only to discover that it doesn't work. So by observing your space, thinking about it for a bit, and just doing something small to begin with is a really great way of baby steps into making these really important and useful changes. Now the next idea is the idea of integration. So we could think, okay, I need more pollinators in my space. I want to get these aphid munchers. I need my healthy soil, so what do I do? And you might think, right, on that far side of my garden, I'm gonna plant a bunch of herbs. But you might want to think of, instead of having on that side of the garden, having it throughout your garden. And last but not least, we want to be designing for the changing of the seasons. So that includes, like I said, creating habitat for these creatures. It also includes creating forage for them all year round. You might also want to have your bulbs for early in the year. Stuff like wild garlic is fantastic because it comes up really early, offers you a yield. Then my probably all-time favourite flowering plant, comfrey. So comfrey starts flowering early in the spring. It goes all the way through the season, and as well as offering flowers constantly with tons of nectar, it's also a dynamic accumulator. It's drawing the nutrients out of the soil, storing them in the leaves, which you can then reincorporate into your garden. So you just cut the leaves off and turn them into plant feed. You can chop the leaves off and lay them on the soil surface, allowing them to rot down into the soil and impart their nutrients. They're fantastic starters for the compost heaps, they're so rich in nitrogen. And so comfrey is really a wonderful plant for the garden, because not only is it feeding the pollinators which bring all these features into your garden, it's also feeding your garden. I just love that about permaculture. I love this idea that things are more than they seem, and all of a sudden when you look at a fly or a hoverfly, you're not just seeing a pollinator, you're seeing pest control, you're seeing a part of a food chain, you're seeing part of an ecosystem, and that to me is just so beautiful. So when we're designing for pollinators, we want to be designing with this complexity in mind, thinking about the diversity of the natural world and trying to really capture that in our spaces to give us resilient systems that will support us as well as the natural world around us. I hope you have enjoyed this conversation, and during the making of this video I spotted about 4 ladybirds. There's hoverflies everywhere. There's actually a lot of them sitting on my feet right now. And I can hear bumblebees and bees constantly. So, you know, it just goes to show a little bit of wildflower meadow goes a long way in the natural world.